Competitive Pokemon ZA is way better than anybody was anticipating, but if you're looking to get in and start competing in the ranked online battles and have the most success, you need to know how to team build. So today we're going to talk about how to build better competitive teams in Pokemon Legends ZA. So if this is your first time here on the channel, make sure you are subscribed for more ZA content like this in the future, but let's get into it. So the first thing we got to do is actually talk about the format of this game because it is different from traditional competitive Pokemon. First up, these are teams of 3 Pokemon per team. So there are only 3 Pokemon that you have to worry about training up and actually taking into battle. And you can have no duplicate Pokemon on any given team, meaning you can't have 2 Pikachu, you can't have 2 Meganium, you have to have all individually different Pokemon. On top of that, you can have no duplicate items on your team. So if you have 2 Pokemon with, let's say, a citrus berry, that is not allowed. Each Pokemon has to be holding a different item in order to compete. So now let's get into actual team building. How do you get in and start building a team to compete and have a lot of success in this game? Well, the first thing you need to consider is what is the most important part of team building, in my opinion, and that's making sure your team covers each other's weaknesses. So for example, the team that I've been using the most right now is Gyarados, Excadrill, and Gardevoir. Why is this team so good? Well, Gyarados is a really positive, tanky bruiser, but is really weak to electric type attacks, right? So Excadrill, being a ground type that doesn't take any damage from those electric type attacks, is really positive into this particular team. So you use it to swap in and eat an electric type hit for the Gyarados. Also, if you look at Gardevoir, very weak to steel type attacks. Excadrill resists steel types attacks. So you can kind of see the idea here where you're balancing out these Pokemon in order to get the most out of them. And the easiest way to go about doing this is with cores. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the concept of cores, there are 2 main types of cores that you're going to see. The first being the fire, water, grass core. And the reason this is the most common is because it's the most basic rock, paper, scissors matchup that you see in competitive Pokemon or Pokemon in general. You know, grass beats water, water beats fire, fire beats grass. It works out just as you expect. So this is a very powerful way to actually build a team, is just have 3 Pokemon that match these particular typings. The other very common core is called the fantasy core. And this consists of a dragon type, a fairy type, and a steel type. The reason for this is things like if you have a dragon type out, a fairy type move is resisted by a steel type that you can swap into. A dragon type is also weak to dragon moves, so you can swap in a fairy to absorb that hit because it doesn't hit fairy types at all. Dragon also resists the fire weakness that steel types have, so you can see how this kind of balances each other out. Now, the thing about these cores is actually understanding that certain Pokemon have additional typings which will increase their weaknesses to other types of Pokemon. For example, if say you're building a fire, water, grass core, right? And let's say that you have a Greninja on your team, just for sake of conversation, right? You have a Greninja and you want to add a fire type Pokemon. Well, you know, a lot of people really like Charizard, but Charizard may not be the best partner for this fire, water, grass core. And why is that? Well, Charizard is also a flying type Pokemon, meaning that it also shares that electric type weakness with a Greninja, which is something that you need to account for. So now you have 2 Pokemon that are weak to electric type attacks, making you kind of in a rough spot to deal with certain type matchups. Or if we were going to look at a fantasy core, right, we can look at Tyrantrum. We can pull up, where is it at? Tyrantrum, okay? Tyrantrum is a dragon type with a rock typing as well. Another Pokemon that would fit on a fantasy core being a steel type would be something like Excadrill, right? So you have Excadrill on this particular team. The problem with these 2 Pokemon, yes, they work in the fantasy core, but their alternate typings don't work particularly well together. For example, Tyrantrum with the rock typing is weak to ground type moves, and Excadrill, being a steel type, is also weak to those ground type moves. So now you have 2 Pokemon that are weak to ground type Pokemon, which is a problem, right? Especially with the amount of Earthquake that's running around in this particular format. So you need to be aware of your Pokemon's secondary typings in order to get the most out of these cores that we talked about. Now let's move on to actually choosing Pokemon for your team. Now, the most common thing that you're seeing is actually Mega Pokemon, right? Like my team here, Gyarados, Excadrill, and Gardevoir. Bunch of Pokemon that can Mega Evolve. And the reason that these are so good is because of the boost that they get for their Mega Evolutions, as well as the automatic plus move activation. Now, plus moves are a new mechanic in Legends ZA that, when activated with the start button, will provide a power boost to your attack. So if I look at Excadrill here, for example, let's go to change moves. You can see this little plus icon next to all my moves here. Those are the plus moves that we're talking about. And the way you actually go about activating these plus moves is you run out here, right? You select the target and you press the plus button. You can see there was a little highlight there. Now all of my plus moves are active. meaning that it'll charge a little bit of my mega energy in order to boost the power of said move to the level of a mega evolution Pokemon, which means that Pokemon that cannot mega evolve can actually have the same power from some of their moves due to the plus move activation. And you can actually go and train these particular moves. So if you fly over here to the Justice Dojo, you can train plus moves onto your Pokemon. So what you'll do is you'll come in here, and if you haven't done it already, there will be a side quest here. You need to complete that side quest in order to unlock this particular feature, and you'll use these items in your inventory, the Seeds of Mastery, to boost a move to a plus move if it is not already. So you'll do that by coming over here, and you'll talk to this girl with the red bandana that you battled a bunch throughout the story, and she will be able to turn your moves into plus moves by using the Seeds of Mastery, very similarly to how you use bottle caps in order to actually increase IVs and things of that nature. So that is how you go about getting additional plus moves on your Pokemon. Now, when you actually start team building in this game, I like to start this process with one Pokemon in mind. So when I started with this first team that I was building, I decided I wanted to use Gyarados. It's a very strong, tanky Pokemon that can take a lot of damage, but also dish out a lot of damage. And this is kind of that bruiser, tankier role. And a lot of things that you're seeing in this particular game is that people like to have two more tanky Pokemon, typically a bruiser like Gyarados, and then a more supporty tanky Pokemon that can like eat some hits and give some additional status effects and things of that nature. And then they have a frail sweeper Pokemon. However, there is some merit to having Pokemon that are like two offensive Pokemon and a bruiser on your particular team. Like with this team here, both my Excadrill and my Gardevoir are built relatively offensively, right? They have max speed and max attack for whatever they need, whether it be special attack or attack, right? So I have two offensive Pokemon that die pretty easily in Gyarados. So there is some merit to changing up the strategy that you have for your particular team based on the conditions that you need. So like I said earlier, I like to start with one Pokemon in mind, and that was Gyarados for this particular team. I wanted to use Gyarados, and then I thought, okay, I need to cover its weaknesses. I need to think about what does this Pokemon do? What moves can I use to cover some things that, you know, would be a problem for me? And then what Pokemon do I add next? And that's how I choose my second Pokemon, is what complements Gyarados. Well, I was like, I have a shiny Excadrill. I'm 4 times weak to electric type attacks with Gyarados. So Excadrill works really nicely because it's immune to electric type attacks. So I'm able to slot in Excadrill, and now I have two Pokemon that cover each other relatively well, right? So Excadrill weak to fighting type moves, Gyarados being a flying type, resist those fighting type moves, and I resist electric type moves with Excadrill. It works very nice together. So I have these two Pokemon. And then I thought to myself, okay, what can I use next? Well, I wanted a strong sweeper Pokemon, so I looked at what Excadrill could resist, what it was weak to, things of that nature, and I found another Pokemon. Looking at Gardevoir, right? Gardevoir is a very strong special attacking sweeper Pokemon that is weak to steel and poison type moves. And which Pokemon resist both of those things? That would be Excadrill. Excadrill resists those steel and poison type moves due to its typing, allowing this Pokemon to work very synonymously with both Gyarados as well as Gardevoir. And that's kind of the process that you go through to figure out what your team needs. But what's also important to consider is having Pokemon with a variety of different attack types. For example, looking at Gyarados and Excadrill, both of these are physical attacking Pokemon. So it wouldn't do me a whole lot of favors to add another physical attacking Pokemon onto this team. I would need a special attacker, especially if you're facing an opponent that has a move like Reflect that is going to boost their defense. That would be very unfortunate if I had a full team of physical attackers. It would make it very difficult for me to break a lot of Pokemon with those higher defensive stats. So having Pokemon that not only complement each other's weaknesses, but also have different stat distributions and can use different move types is going to give you an advantage when you're trying to dish out some damage. Now, briefly, I want to talk about EVs in this particular video because I had some questions from other videos that people were like, how do you go about deciding what to EV train on a Pokemon? And I think that's important. I'm not going to go into the specifics of how to EV train. That's already covered in my beginner's guide to competitive Pokemon, and I will link that in the description below, so you guys can check that out if you need to know that information. But how I go about actually deciding what to EV onto a Pokemon is kind of based on their stats. So if I pull up a Pokemon here, for example, let's just use Gyarados because we've been talking about Gyarados, right? Very good Pokemon. We take a look at its stat distribution here, right? 95 HP, pretty good. Defense is pretty solid as well at 79. It's not the best, but it's not the worst. And its special defense is pretty solid at 100. Then you look at its different attacks stats, right? We have the attack at 125 and the special attack at 60. that already indicates to us that this is not a special attacking Pokemon, right? We're looking right at that, and this Pokemon does not benefit from special attacks at all. So moves like Hydro Pump, moves like Hurricane, they're not going to do as much damage as a physical attack is going to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is max out my attack stat, because this is going to be my more offensive physical attacking Pokemon. Then I look at its HP and its speed. In this particular game, those are the two most important things that you're going to look at, and specifically because, you know, HP is going to make you more bulky. It's just going to make you able to eat more hits in this particular game. And seeing that Gyarados has pretty decent defensive stats to begin with, I don't really feel like I need to invest a ton. Speed directly impacts your ability to have move cooldowns come in a bit more effectively, right? So if you have a higher speed, your cooldowns are going to be shortened. But looking at Gyarados, I can see that my speed stat's not particularly high to begin with, and even investing in speed is not going to give me a ton of an advantage. But with my defensive stats and my HP being relatively high, it would make more sense for me to use this as a tanky bruiser, right? So I do 252 and 252, 252 HP, 252 attack is going to give me the biggest advantage. And then typically what I've been doing with these kind of Pokemon is slotting just the extra 4 EVs into the speed stat just to give me a little bit of a cooldown. I think it's such a minor, minuscule amount of cooldown that probably there's more benefit to throwing it into one of the defensive slots, but I just haven't been worried about it. Personally, I just slot it into speed. But that's how I go about looking at what I want to actually EV train on a Pokemon. So let's look at another Pokemon. Let's go to Greninja like we talked about earlier. Looking at Greninja, we look at that attack versus its special attack. What is higher? Special attack. So what are you going to get the most advantage out of? That's going to be your special attacks. Now, Greninja is a special case because it is a decent attack stat as well. So you can kind of get away with running this Pokemon either way, but I would still, most of the time, do something like this. I would get 252 special attack simply because that special attack is higher, and I'm going to get more benefit out of having my special attack maxed out versus my attack maxed out. I always in this game have been going for the attack stat maxed out. I have yet to find an instance where I wanted to focus more on a defensive stat than focusing on the attack stat. The attack stat I always want maxed out, at least with every team that I've built so far. This seems to be the best course of action. Now, as the meta develops and as people learn more things, this could definitely change up. This is definitely not going to be the end-all be-all, but for getting started with picking your EVs, this is going to be probably the easiest way to go about doing that. And then again, I look at the HP and I look at the speed. Greninja has a wickedly high speed, right? Already very fast. And then if you change it to a Mega Greninja, it gets 20 more speed points. So it's at 142. So in this instance, I already have a relatively low cooldown, right? It's already naturally fast. I'm going to have quicker cooldowns, and Greninja's relatively frail, so I'm going to max out my HP because I want this to be able to survive maybe 1 or 2 extra hits to be able to maximize my amount of damage with that speed stat and the special attack being up. So that's kind of my thought process as far as going through different EVs and how I apply them to Pokemon. Now, the next thing that you actually want to think about is what moves you want on your particular Pokemon. Now, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer. It really is just dependent on what you have in mind for the use case of each particular Pokemon on your team. And the first thing you want to consider when selecting moves for your team is Stab, which stands for same type attack bonus. And this means that any move used by a Pokemon that matches the Pokemon's type gets a 1.5 damage boost. So for example, looking at my Excadrill here, you can see that I'm running Earthquake on my Excadrill, which is a ground type move. And because Excadrill is a ground type, that Earthquake is going to get 1.5 times damage boost. However, I am also running Rock Slide on my Excadrill, right? So Rock Slide is not a type that matches up with the ground and steel typing of Excadrill. Rock Slide is a rock type move, so I'm not going to get that additional 1.5 times boost. However, there is merit to having moves like Rock Slide on this particular Pokemon. The reason that is because it's called a coverage move. And coverage moves are used to give you an advantage over Pokemon that normally you would struggle with. For example, Fire type are super effective against Excadrill because of its steel typing. However, looking at things like Charizard specifically, normally you'd be able to cover those fire type weaknesses with your Earthquake, but Charizard is also a flying type Pokemon, meaning I can't touch it with my ground type moves. So what Rock Slide does is actually cover for that flying typing that Charizard has. Another example is Gyarados. Gyarados hits you for super effective damage because of your ground typing. Gyarados is also a flying type Pokemon, so Rock Slide gives me the ability to hit Gyarados for super effective damage and potentially KO it before it can KO me. This is just a very common practice as far as moves go in general. For example, things like Crunch or Bounce like I'm not running Mega Gyarados here, right? So Crunch isn't getting any sort of stab type damage, but it's giving me an advantage over certain Pokemon that normally I would have issues with. Or looking at Gardevoir. Gardevoir is getting very common with Thunderbolt in this meta, and the reason for that is Gyarados is incredibly common. It's so common all over the place, and having a strong special attacker with a move like Thunderbolt, even though it does not actually get a stab bonus, is allowing Gardevoir to be able to deal massive damage to a Gyarados because of its 4-time electric type weakness, giving you an edge over Pokemon that normally you wouldn't have super effective damage against. So you kind of have to weigh these options with the Pokemon on what coverage moves you would like. Another thing you have to consider is how different moves actually interact with the Pokemon around them, right? Different moves behave differently in this game. For example, if I use Psychic here, this locks on and just takes the KO, right? It just knocks out that Pokemon. However, if I was to use something like Moonblast, let me find another wild Pokemon here. There's a Weedle up there. I target that and I go for Moonblast. There is a travel time on that particular move, which means it can be dodged. It's not an auto lock on. Or if I use something like Dazzling Gleam, I'll use it right here on this. I have to run up to the target and then do that in order to get the attack off. So different moves behave differently in this game, and learning how each move changes and how they interact with the Pokemon around them is going to be very crucial to how you pick certain moves and how you play around in this game. Another perfect example, if I pull out my Gyarados here, right? This, in normal games, a move like Bounce is a 2-turn move. However, in this game, it just adds a turn, a longer cast time, for example. So using Bounce on this, my Gyarados is going to disappear, and it cannot be hit during this time, and then drop down on the opponent. So this not only is good to get my Gyarados out of the way in order to, you know, kind of avoid a move, avoid a super effective attack, and set the opposing Pokemon on cooldown. Moves like Fly, Bounce, things of that nature, Phantom Force, Dig, that take a Pokemon out of play are going to not only avoid attacks, but also be able to dish out damage in the process, which makes them very powerful. Another example is Waterfall, right? Waterfall is going to charge a dash attack, and it's going to dash for an X amount of distance, hitting every target in the path, not just one target. So learning how these different moves interact with the world around you is very important. Another move type to consider are retreat moves. So for example, I have my Talonflame out here, and it has the ability U-turn. So when I use U-turn, it runs up, does the attack, and then it immediately dashes back to my side, allowing you to deal damage and then retreat the Pokemon back to you to avoid a hit. This is very, very beneficial for certain Pokemon. Another example of this would be Volt Switch or something to that effect, that allows the Pokemon to return to you rather than stick there and just get damaged and potentially get KO'd. There are also priority moves. These are things like Quick Attack, Aqua Jet, or Shadow Sneak, or Extreme Speed that are going to be very quick attacks that the Pokemon just dashes very fast to the target. And typically these attacks are going to do a smaller amount of damage, but they are really beneficial for securing yourself a KO on a particular Pokemon that is already at low HP. So these are another way to give you an upper hand and make more KOs. And some moves like Stealth Rock, Toxic Spikes, Spikes in general are going to cause a hazard-like effect, or even moves like Whirlpool or Fire Spin, things of that nature are going to cause an area of effect on the field. So for example, if I use Whirlpool with my Gyarados here, this area here now causes damage by standing in it. So if there's a bunch of enemies clustered up and they're constantly doing battle in a certain space, these moves can be beneficial for chipping away at all of them and potentially securing some extra KOs and dealing some extra damage, which is really nice. Finally, we're going to talk about screen moves, and these are pretty important as well. So for example, Light Screen is going to raise your special defense and Reflect is going to raise your defense. And I can use this by targeting a Pokemon, and you can see the screens get set up around my Pokemon here, my Slowbro. However, if I were to swap out my Pokemon, that Pokemon retains the screens, which is a really powerful strategy in order to get bonus defenses on a potentially more frail Pokemon when you're battling. So if I swap to something like Gardevoir after getting screens up, Gardevoir could eat more hits and secure more KOs. The final thing I want to talk about are status moves, and these can be very beneficial as well, specifically looking at things like Thunder Wave, you know, a poison type move like Toxic or something to that effect. So just for example, I'm going to go ahead and hit this with Thunder Wave. And that's kind of the general idea. It's going to cause paralysis on that Pokemon. It's going to cause some issues, right? And it's very important to know what these statuses do because they are different from standard competitive Pokemon. So first off, poison causes damage over time. That's all it does, just chips a bunch of damage away. Burn is also going to cause damage over time, but it halves the physical damage from the burnt Pokemon, meaning things that do a lot of physical damage like Gyarados and things of that nature are going to do half the amount of damage if they are burnt. Paralysis halves the effective Pokemon's movement speed, which means they are much more slow and unable to dodge attacks as easily. Drowsy is going to slow the move cooldowns of the effective Pokemon, so they're going to get their moves back more slowly. Confusion increases the chance that the effective Pokemon misses an attack, and Frozen locks a Pokemon in place, unable to move or attack until they thaw out. The last thing that we need to talk about are items on your Pokemon. Now, the most common thing that you're seeing are a lot of teams of 3 Pokemon that can Mega Evolve, and a lot of people are running 3 Pokemon all with Mega Evolution items. So Gardevoir has the Gardevoirite, Excadrill would have the Excadrillite, and Gyarados would have the Gyaradoseite. However, this is not the most optimal way to team build. Why is that? Well, because of the fact that you can only Mega Evolve 1 Pokemon at a time. So once you Mega Evolve, say, Gardevoir, you can't Mega Evolve the other 2 Pokemon, and if you have to swap into them, their held item is now doing nothing for them. So it's more beneficial to pick a different item that you would be able to apply to that Pokemon to give them an effect that is more beneficial than a Mega Stone that can't be used, right? So as you can see, my Gyarados has an Assault Vest here, and my Excadrill has a Focus Sash on this particular team. And you can actually go and buy items over at Rancine Construction. So I'm going to fly over there and show you guys where you can find them. And you're going to find these just inside. You're going to go right in, and you're going to hang a right through the door here, and you're going to talk to these 2 dudes. These guys have all the battle items that you will need, aside from like things like berries, right? You can get berries all over the map. They're scattered all over the place. I have tons of them already, and there's only a handful of berries that you'll actually want to use for competitive play. But the rest of the items that you would likely want to use, like Assault Vest, Focus Sash, Expert Belt, all those can be bought at these 2 guys right here. And they're usually around 5,000 Pokedollars for each item, so really relatively inexpensive. But let me just provide you with some examples of situations where held items can be better than those Mega Stones. So for example, my Gyarados is the main Tank Bruiser Pokemon on my team, but electric type moves are a problem because of its 4-time weakness. But if I add the Assault Vest to that Pokemon instead of the Gyaradoseite, the Assault Vest increases my Pokemon's special defense, allowing Gyarados to take electric type hits from special attackers, which are pretty common right now, like Gardevoir using Thunderbolt or Ampharos. I'm able to take those hits more effectively with that Assault Vest than I would be without it, allowing Gyarados to potentially live those hits and be able to continue battling. Another example is my Excadrill. My Excadrill is built very offensively with little defensive investment, but if I put a Focus Sash on it, if my Excadrill would be one-shot, it will now live with 1 HP, allowing me to potentially get one final attack off and secure a KO rather than go down immediately. So there's a lot of these benefits that outweigh the usefulness of the Mega Evolution items on particular teams for certain Pokemon. But that is going to wrap up this video on how to build better competitive teams for Pokemon Legends EA ranked battles. Let me know if you have any comments, questions, concerns, or anything like that in the comments below. I try to answer all of them, and I do have a full guide on how to actually get into competitive Pokemon that is also linked in the description below, so that way you guys can check that out if you're getting into competitive play fresh and need to know all the nitty-gritty details of that fun stuff. You can check that video out. But like I said, that is it. Leave a like, comment, and subscribe because it helps me out, helps the video out, helps the channel out immensely. But until next time, peace.